Welcome back to Fragments of Faith. Last week we stepped into a sentence that shows up in some of the most fragile moments of people's lives. Everything happens for a reason. We didn't rush it. We didn't try to defend it. We just sat with it and what it does to people when it lands at the wrong time. And since that conversation, uh, what's been lingering with me it isn't just the phrase itself. It's the instinct behind it. Because that sentence doesn't usually come from cruelty. It comes from discomfort, from standing in front of someone's pain and not knowing what to do with it. There's something about watching someone suffer that makes us feel small and powerless and exposed. And when we feel that, our reflex is usually to reach for words, to offer perspective, to point toward meaning, or to say something that sounds steady, because silence feels dangerous. Silence feels like we're failing, like we're not helping, like we're abandoning them to the weight of what just happened. But I've been thinking about how often the rush to explain isn't actually about the person who's hurting. It's about the person who's uncomfortable. There's this quiet pressure in our culture and honestly sometimes in faith spaces that pain has to be interpreted quickly. That suffering needs a takeaway, that tragedy has to have a lesson, that grief should eventually resolve into something inspiring. And if we can't find that right away, we scramble. We say things too soon. We reach too far. We assign meaning that doesn't belong to us. But when you strip it all down, when you take away the commentary and the frameworks and the impulse to make it all make sense, what most people remember about their hardest moments isn't who explained it best. It's who stayed, who sat down, who didn't flinch, who didn't try to manage the atmosphere, who just allowed the weight of it to be what it was. There is a kind of silence that feels cold and distant, but I think there's another kind that feels like protection, like someone guarding the space around your grief instead of crowding it. I keep thinking about hospital rooms, about living rooms after bad news, about kitchen tables where nobody knows what to say, and how often the kindest response in those spaces isn't insight, it's restraint. It's the humility to admit, I don't need to explain this. Whitney, you and I have both seen this play out in very real ways. And I know for you, there were moments when people tried to make sense of what was happening. Sometimes quickly, sometimes with good intentions, but there were also people who didn't try to solve it. They just stayed. And I'm curious, what stands out to you now when you think about that difference?
Yeah, so I've seen both. There were absolutely people who said nice things. And I don't mean that sarcastically. They meant well. They brought food. And honestly, food is such a good thing to bring. When someone you love dies, showering is hard. I mean, cooking is basically impossible. But a lot of the nice words people kind of pieced out. It was like, here's something comforting. Hope that helps. Now I'm going to step back because this is uncomfortable. I don't blame them. I mean, I really don't. Most people don't know how to stay in something like that. But what stands out to me now is that the words faded. I don't remember most of the nice things people said. What I do remember are the people who admitted, I have no idea what to say, and then sat there anyway, even though it was awkward, uncomfortable. The friends who packed a bag and stayed at my house after each funeral, they didn't try to pull me out of anything. I mean, they even carried the weight of the friendship when I couldn't. They checked on me. They made sure I ate. I mean, they handled things I didn't have the energy to handle. I was barely functioning. Breathing felt like a Herculean effort. Reaching out to anybody? Not happening. There was one friend who realized that even texting me to check in was too much for me to deal with. I mean, I just couldn't. So she started sending what she called alive checks, and she would text me, "Are you breathing?" And all I had to text her back was that I was alive. That was it. No pressure, no deep conversation, no expectation that I process anything. Just, "Are you still here?" She adjusted to what I could give. And that told me something. Not everyone is going to know how to love a grieving person that well. I don't expect that. I mean, but when someone is willing to pay attention, to notice your capacity and meet you there, that sticks with you. So when I think about the difference now, it's basically this: the people who tried to make sense of it usually left after they said their piece. The people who knew they couldn't make sense of it stayed. They adapted. They carried me when I couldn't carry myself. And after the worst day of your life, twice, that's what matters. Not the explanation, but the presence.
Yeah, listening to you talk about that, I don't just hear your story. I've heard your story, but in this conversation, I feel confronted by it because I can see myself in both categories. As a pastor, I've been in hospital rooms where I stood at the foot of the bed and tried to find something steady to say. I've quoted scripture. I've offered perspective. I've tried to bring calm into the chaos. And I don't think any of it was insincere. I believed what I was saying. I think for some of those people it was comforting. But if I'm honest, sometimes I said those things because I didn't know what else to do with the silence. There's this moment in hospital rooms, you know it, where the monitors are still making noise, the machines are still working, but everything in the air feels suspended. Everybody in the room's looking at everybody else, waiting for somebody to say something that makes it less terrifying. And I've stepped into that gap with words, and then I've also been in rooms where I didn't, where I just I just sat down, where I didn't have anything to offer except proximity. And those two experiences feel completely different internally. When I speak, I feel like I'm doing my job. I feel like I'm contributing something. I feel like I'm steady. When I stay silent, I feel exposed because then I'm just another human in the room who can't stop what's happening. And I think that's the part we don't talk about enough. Being present without explanation removes the illusion of control. You can't hide behind insight. You can't lean on clarity. You can't organize the pain into something digestible. You just feel it with them. And I've also been on the other side. I've been in rooms where something heavy was happening in my own life and someone stepped in with certainty. They meant well. They were trying to help. But I could feel the subtle shift. Once they delivered their comfort, there was kind of emotional exit, like the responsibility had been discharged. And then I've experienced the opposite. Someone who didn't try to stabilize the moment with language. They just stayed long enough that the silence stopped feeling threatening. They didn't solve anything, but they didn't disappear either. And the difference isn't dramatic on the surface. It's quiet. It's almost invisible, but internally it lands completely different. One feels like someone stepping in and stepping out. The other feels like someone sharing oxygen. And hearing you talk about the people who adjusted to your capacity, who didn't require you to engage at a level that you couldn't sustain, that hits me as both beautiful and indicting because adjustment requires attention. It requires patience. It requires slowing down enough to notice when someone's energy has collapsed and resisting them resisting the urge to pull them back to where you're comfortable. And that's hard, especially in faith spaces, because we're trained to bring hope. We're trained to speak truth. We're trained to reassure. And yeah, those things matter. But what I've had to learn slowly is that truth delivered at the wrong moment can feel like pressure. Hope offered too quickly can feel like a demand. And sometimes reassurance can feel like trying to stabilize the room instead of sitting in it. I've had to ask myself some hard questions about that. When I step into a room where something irreversible has happened, am I speaking because it's needed or am I speaking because I'm uncomfortable? Am I trying to serve the person in front of me or am I trying to quiet the tension in the room or at least in myself? Staying in something that isn't changing forces me to face fears that I usually keep at a distance. It reminds me of how little control any of us actually have. It reminds me that there are moments when faith doesn't remove the weight, it just keeps us breathing under it. There's a kind of closeness to suffering that strips away the scripts we usually rely on. The pastoral voice doesn't work, the fixer instinct doesn't work, even the well-meaning friend voice can fall flat. All the roles that normally give us footing suddenly feel thin. You're just you're just there. You're just another person watching something you can't fix. And that can feel at best disorienting or worse, like failure. But maybe it isn't. Maybe the discomfort we feel in those spaces isn't a sign that we're doing something wrong. Maybe it's a sign that we're finally not hiding. And I think that's why staying is rare because staying means you got to feel it too. It means letting someone else's grief brush up against your own fear of loss. It means not having the comfort of resolution. Most of us aren't taught how to live there. So let me ask you, why do you think that kind of closeness to pain is so hard for people? What is it about simply remaining without solving that makes so many of us want to retreat?
When I really sit with that question, like why remaining is so hard, I don't think it's because people are cold. I think it's because it's terrifying. I mean, nobody likes feeling useless in the face of something catastrophic. But I think there's another part underneath it. Staying close to someone's pain forces you to confront the fact that it could be you. When you sit in a hospital room with a family whose world just changed, you can't pretend suffering is theoretical anymore. I mean, it's not a concept. You just saw tragedy firsthand. And I think that's why people retreat. Because if I stay too long in your grief, I have to admit that I'm not protected from it either. I mean, I don't think there's a formula. I mean, there's no guaranteed outcome. There's no sentence that is going to keep tragedy from knocking on my door next. And that's scary. I'm not a pastor. I mean, no one calls me to bring scripture into rooms, but I have been called. I've gotten texts that say, hey, my kid's breathing really weird. Is this normal? And I've been the one who had to say, no, you need to call hospice. I have walked parents through what the last few hours might look like so they weren't blindsided by it. So, in a different way, I was also called to do a job, but my job wasn't to explain why it was happening. It was more to prepare them for what was about to happen. And I think there's a difference there. I wasn't trying to make it make sense. I was trying to keep them from being slapped in the face by what will inevitably come next. And even then, I've had to check myself. Am I giving them information because it will actually steady them? Or am I filling space because watching someone else step into that reality just hurts my heart all over again? I think sometimes direction matters. Sometimes clarity is mercy. I mean, because the unknown is what scares us in that moment. I mean, you know, but I've learned that if I move too quickly into here's what helped me or here's what this means, I risk making their moment about my survival instead of being present in their pain. I think staying is hard because it strips away your identity. You know, you're not the pastor. I'm not the strong one surviving. You're not the one with the right words. And I'm not the one with the experience. I mean, we're both just human. And humans do not like standing in rooms where we have zero control. But I also think that remaining in that room gets easier when you've already lived through the worst possible thing. Not because you're stronger, but because the illusion of control is already gone. When you have buried a child, you don't need to convince yourself that the world is fragile. I mean, you already know it. So sitting in someone else's fragility or vulnerability doesn't shock you the same way. I mean, it still hurts, it'll still wreck you, but you're not scrambling to preserve a worldview that says this definitely won't happen to me. I do think proximity to real suffering changes how tightly you cling to explanations. I mean, once you've lived it, you don't need to solve it to survive it. And you stop trying to manage the moment because you don't panic in that silence anymore. Maybe the real question isn't why people retreat. Maybe it's why we're so uncomfortable admitting that we can't fix everything.
Admitting we can't fix something forces us to face a limit that most of us spend our lives trying to outrun. We build our confidence around competence. We build our sense of value around being dependable. We learn early that being useful is how we matter. And then suffering shows up and it doesn't respond to any of that. We can be thoughtful, we can be faithful, we can be experienced and still not be able to change what's happening right in front of us. And that does something to us. A lot of my internal stability has been tied to the belief that I can step into a situation and contribute something that improves it. Not perfectly, not always dramatically, but at least directionally. And when I step into a room where nothing I bring changes the trajectory, I feel the ground shift under me. It exposes how much of my peace was quietly connected to control. And we don't usually name that. We call it responsibility. We call it leadership. We call it strength. But underneath that is the assumption that if we try hard enough, if we know enough, if we pray enough, if we prepare enough, we can keep disaster from crossing certain lines. And when it does anyway, then we feel exposed. There's a moment in Second Corinthians where Paul talks about having a thorn in the flesh, and he asks for it to be removed more than once. And the answer isn't removal; it's my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness, which sounds beautiful until we realize what it means. It means the thorn stays. It means the limit remains. It means that God's power doesn't always show up by fixing the circumstance. Sometimes it shows up by sustaining us inside something that doesn't change. And if that's true, then weakness isn't theoretical, it's lived. And I think that's what makes remaining so hard because when we stay close to someone else's suffering, we're not just watching their limits, we're confronting our own. We're sitting inside a reminder that we don't get to override reality. We don't get to guarantee safety. We don't get to promise outcomes. We don't get to shield people from everything. And that clashes with the version of strength we've been carrying. It's easier to give advice than it is to sit powerless. It's easier to offer meaning than to accept mystery. It's easier to speak than it is to feel. And sitting in something that we can't change doesn't give us anything to grab onto. It just asks us to remain. And remaining requires surrender. Not not surrender in the dramatic sense, but surrender of the need to be the one who changes the ending. Maybe that's what we're actually resisting. Not silence, not grief, but the humility of saying this is beyond me. Because once we admit that, we lose the illusion that we're the stabilizing force in every storm. And that's uncomfortable. But maybe it's also freeing because if we stop trying to fix everything, maybe we're finally able to love without attaching our worth to the outcome. So when we talk about people retreating, I honestly think it's fear. Not just fear of suffering, but fear of discovering how little control we actually have. And then having to live honestly inside of that. You said something earlier that I keep going back to, that once you've lived through the worst thing, the illusion is already gone. You're not you're not scrambling to preserve a worldview that says this won't happen to me. So here's what I'm wondering. For people who haven't walked through that kind of loss, who haven't had that illusion shattered, is there a way to grow into this kind of remaining without tragedy being the teacher? Uh, how do you think we can learn to let go of control before life forces us to, or is that something that most of us only understand on the other side of devastation?
I don't think devastation is the only teacher. I think it's the loudest one, but I don't think it's the only way someone learns how to stay. Because if I'm honest, life gives us smaller losses all the time, smaller disappointments, smaller endings, smaller moments where we're not in control. We just don't treat them like a training ground. I mean, we rush through them. We minimize them. We fix them quickly, to distract ourselves. But every time something doesn't go our way, every time someone is uncomfortable in front of us and we resist the urge to try and immediately fix it, I see it as practice. I mean, staying is essentially a muscle. You don't build it that day that catastrophe shows up. You build it in the small moments when someone says, I'm not okay. And you don't immediately respond with a solution. You build it when you let silence sit for a few seconds longer than feels normal. I think you build it when you say, I don't know what to say. And then you don't follow it with something meant to comfort. You build it when you don't try to turn every hard thing into a lesson. I mean, tragedy doesn't magically make someone good at staying, it just exposes whether they've ever practiced it. And I think that's the part we don't talk about. I mean, we assume maturity shows up when suffering shows up, but maturity is built long before that. And if we actually trained ourselves and maybe trained our communities to tolerate discomfort in smaller ways, maybe we wouldn't bail when the big things hit.
Yeah, and I think this is where it gets real for a lot of people because it's one thing to talk about staying as a concept. It's another thing to recognize yourself in the part that fixes or rushes or disappears when it gets heavy. And I don't think that recognition needs to come with shame. I think most of us learn to fix because that's what felt loving. We learn to problem solve. We learn to offer perspective or lighten the mood. We learn to move things forward. And I think that comes from wanting to help, but maybe what this conversation does is gently expose that helping and remaining aren't always the same thing. There's a difference. We're not talking about becoming cold or passive. We're talking about tolerating discomfort long enough for someone else to feel less alone. And that's a skill. It's formed, it's strengthened, and honestly, this isn't theoretical for us. The reason this podcast even exists is because we practiced this before there were microphones. We had conversations where you were wrestling and I didn't try to straighten it out. We had conversations where I had questions and you didn't rush to try to answer. We stayed in things that didn't resolve in that conversation, and a lot of them still aren't resolved. That's what built the trust that makes this work. Not agreement, not answers, just the willingness to keep showing up when it would have been easier to pivot away. We are 9 episodes in, and we agreed that at the end of every episode, we'd still be friends. Some episodes, that's easier than others.
Yeah.
But I think that willingness to keep showing up, uh, it doesn't require perfection. It just requires awareness. Maybe the first step isn't becoming someone who never fixes. Maybe it's just noticing the moment you feel the urge to fix. That split second when someone says something heavy and you feel yourself reaching for a solution. And instead of acting on it immediately, you just pause. You stay in the room. Even if you feel awkward, even if you feel exposed, even if you don't know what to say. Because staying isn't about having nothing to offer. It's about deciding that your presence is enough for now. And the best part about that is we don't have to reinvent ourselves. We just have to slow down enough to choose differently in small moments. So if someone's listening and they're realizing that they default to fixing or they've stepped back when things got too heavy, what would you want them to carry from this? I mean, not necessarily as a rule, but as something steady that they can hold on to the next time they're in that room.
All right, first, I want to say I actually agree with you this once. Don't get used to it. But yeah, you're right. This isn't theoretical for us. I mean, this isn't two people sitting behind microphones talking about a concept. The only reason this works, the only reason this podcast exists is because we practiced staying. We've had conversations that didn't resolve. I mean, we've had nights where one of us was spiraling and the other one didn't try to fix it. We've had tons of disagreements that we did not clean up, but we kept showing up. So if someone is listening to this and they're realizing, oh, I might be a fixer, or I think I might be the one who backs away when it gets heavy. The takeaway isn't do better. It's slower than that. Just notice it. Notice the urge to fix. Notice the urge to pivot. Notice the urge to make it less awkward. And maybe choose to stay longer than you normally would. I mean, that's it. You don't have to solve someone's life. You don't have to offer the perfect sentence. You don't have to become a different person overnight. Just don't leave the room so fast because presence feels different than explanation. And if nothing else, that's something we can all practice. We'll see you next week.